Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Michael. I hope you're doing as good as possible and that you're able to find ways to cultivate doing things you love on the creativity front in spite of everything that's happening on a global scale. In my opinion, in these times of uncertainty, having access to reliable ways of unlocking and expressing our musical creativity becomes a very powerful tool to strengthen a positive mindset to weather the storm. This video is the first installment of a new video series concept I'm going to experiment with on my channel. The Real Talk and Chill videos series is going to be focusing on discussing potentially more abstract subjects related to music and technology in general, which can ultimately have a profound impact on our user experience as electronic music production enthusiasts. Generally speaking, the pace of these videos is going to be more relaxed and aimed at viewers that are actively seeking occasions to take the time to just sit back, breathe, and reflect on things to develop a better understanding of the interconnectedness of things in order to hopefully reevaluate where we see ourselves going with our music exploration process in the middle of this ongoing technological revolution. If you're someone that's systematically fast forwarding through every single YouTube video you come across in order to maximize the quantity of information you ingest in the smallest amount of time possible, simply put, this video series might not be for you unless you actually like the idea of taking a break from doing that for a change. In this video, I'll be discussing and sharing my views on the current state of the iOS platform, specifically in the context of music production. Now that I've had about a year to really get accustomed to the iOS ecosystem for making music, I developed an understanding which I thought was worth starting a conversation over. Pretty much everything I'm going to discuss is going to be anchored in my own experience, and it will reflect the understanding I have of how things click on a holistic level in the context of the iOS environment and music production. I'll be focusing on the iPad, no surprises here, but the presence of the iPhone is also important in the middle of all this, as you can see from my setup. So that brings us back to the question that sparked the idea of this video, which is, why does it appear to be so difficult for the iOS platform as a music production environment to really take off on a large scale? And what's the future of iOS based off of this trajectory? That's obviously a very complex subject to tackle, but I'll bring into light key elements I believe are a great starting point to at least begin to understand what are, some of the big factors at play when it comes to this topic of discussion. First, let's begin with what makes the iPad Pro special compared to the other equipment typically used in music production. The answer to this question essentially revolves around 1. The format of the device, 2. The advantages of the platform for handling audio specifically, 3. The input methods that the iPad relies on, specifically the touchscreen, 4. The extent of the connectivity available to the iPad Pro, and ultimately 5. the raw computational power of the device in combination with the other elements I just mentioned. In other words, if you try to think of another device that brings together the combination, and that's really the key word here, of all the most important attributes that the iPad Pro brings to the table, simply put, there's not a single other device on the market that can compete with the iPad Pro. Fundamentally, I'm really not happy that given the current state of things, the iPad doesn't face any competition, in the music field at least, as this makes it very tempting for Apple to develop and maintain exploitative business practices that ultimately make developers think twice about making apps for the platform. However, at the end of the day, my priority is to have access to powerful technology that enables me to make music in a manner where I can achieve a compelling state of immersion and flow, while also being in control of the level of complexity of the setup that I limit myself to in order to avoid getting overwhelmed with technology while making music. When it comes to music production technology, given my current understanding of things, the iPad is the only truly viable option I've been able to identify so far, which I know is a crazy statement to make considering the existence of PCs and Macs and the fact that people have been making music on these platforms for over 40 years. My perspective on this is really coming more from an angle of the vision that I have of the attributes that an ideal interface would have in order to maximize immersion and to effortlessly induce a state of flow. So I'm not thinking in terms of, oh, these guys have made it work for all these years using PCs and Macs, so why can't you? No. I'm approaching the whole subject from an angle of attempting to define a new standard for integrating today's technology into a music making pipeline that is fully aligned with my needs and preferences, while prioritizing the immersion factor and the setup's tendency to induce a state of flow. In that pursuit, as far as I'm concerned, there are no hard limits to how far I'm willing to go off the beaten path in order to get my music making pipeline in an ideal state. And I'm not the kind of guy that's going to settle with something mediocre out of fear, of what people might think, whether it's that my approach is excessive or focuses on the wrong things or whatever else. Anyhow, moving on, I'll give you an example to at least get you started to begin understanding why I came to the conclusion that the iPad Pro is the only truly viable option available. Everybody can agree that when it comes down to the responsiveness, and with the word responsiveness, I mean specifically the time it takes between the moment where you tap the iPad's touch screen and the moment where a sound comes out, tablets manufactured by Apple and Samsung represent the reference in terms of touchscreen technology responsiveness. Because Samsung and Android have effectively no presence in the music production world, the only choice that remains in practice is Apple's iPad Pro. Now, with that information in mind, if you were to make a test where you would load a virtual MIDI controller keyboard surface in AUM and you attempted to have AUM send MIDI data based on your real-time touchscreen inputs as you test tapping on that virtual keyboard controller, in an optimal scenario, the kind of latency you would get would be in the ballpark of around 15 milliseconds or probably more. And this is by using strictly USB to connect the devices. I want to really emphasize here that I am strictly talking about touchscreen input latency to control devices that are external to the iPad Pro. Already that 15 milliseconds latency floor disqualifies using the iPad Pro as a professional grade live MIDI controller specifically for playing notes using virtual MIDI controller structures, such as this one. The implication here is that even though on paper the iPad's touchscreen technology is the miracle solution that can enable users to bypass many of the shortcomings of hardware control surfaces, if you were to use the iPad more as an advanced controller with a deep level of integration with theoretical software that would be based on a PC or a Mac where you have access to much more computational power, you would still be faced with the problem of latency or responsiveness. That means that ultimately, given the current state of the technology that's available to us, the iPad Pro in its current form cannot be considered by big name developers and major music hardware companies as a no compromise intermediary device to leverage the power of a PC or a Mac while having a latency that aligns with the needs of professionals who absolutely need to have an imperceptible latency when triggering sounds in real time. All this builds up to the main point I've been wanting to make all this time, which is that by keeping the entire music making process contained within the iPad Pro directly, rather than using the iPad as a theoretical advanced controller extension of a PC or Mac setup with an unrealistically flawless level of integration, the potential of actually interacting with the iPad Pro touchscreen and to achieve a level of latency that is low enough to acknowledge the iPad Pro as a proper musical instrument that is truly viable for live use really starts to emerge. So for now, that wraps up what I wanted to cover regarding the iPad Pro's special status in the current electronic music production meta. Now let's move on to the next big topic, which is the impact of Apple's App Store business model and policies on developers' willingness to invest in the platform. In case you don't already know, Apple currently takes a 30% cut off of every app sold by a developer. If the developer's income is less than $1 million per year, the developer becomes eligible to be subjected to a 15% cut instead. Additionally, on top of this tax, developers have to pay a $99 fee to Apple just to be able to sell their app on the App Store. Right away, we can clearly see that this seriously discourages big developers from investing significant resources in the platform, as that 30% cut is very substantial. If I was a major developer in the music software world, why would I subject myself to having 30% of my income eaten away by a third party when I could invest resources to build a website and all the infrastructure I would need to be able to take payments, etc. With quick math, we can easily see that if we take the number 70 and add 30 to it, the added amount represents roughly a 43% increase relatively to the original number 70. That alone is a major part of the problem. In fact, it's probably the biggest part of the problem. What big-name software developer company in their right mind would choose to build their entire business model around a hardware platform where they're essentially at the mercy of a third party whose policies are absolutely not guaranteed to remain consistent, and which would imply that the developer would receive an income that could be 43% more than what it is, just based on the price that the customers are willing to pay for a particular theoretical product. This plays a massive role in explaining why the platform isn't taking off at the pace that it could in theory. When it comes to independent small developers, though, a very interesting shift happens as Apple now diminishes the developer's income only by 17.6% compared to what it could have been if there was no tax at all. So just to be clear here, I'll give you a clear example. Let's say the customer pays $100. Apple takes $15. The developer gets $85. $15 represents 17.6% of $85, which means that if Apple's tax did not exist, the developer would make 17.6% more money. Again, this 17.6% number should be compared to the massive 43% number, which applies for developers who bring in more than $1 million per year through the App Store. So big developers have to overcome a tax that is effectively about 2.44 times more impactful in the context of their potential income compared to small developers that are below the $1 million yearly income threshold. All of a sudden, running a one-man operation as a developer has a clear appeal as Apple provides a solid distribution platform for developers to sell their products without the challenges and responsibilities attached to having to build their own website and developing the capacity to take online payments directly. In addition to this, as a developer, having access to such a widely used hardware platform, which is essentially at the cutting edge of technological progress, is incredibly appealing. This takes me to the next important topic I wanted to touch on in this video, which is that one-man operation developers are still just one man. A major side effect of the implications of what I just explained is that now small developers are encouraged to work in isolation to ensure that they don't go above the $1 million yearly income threshold. The understanding I have of this is that if, for example, we were to consider 3 genius individuals in a scenario where they got to work as a group to develop music software on iOS versus a scenario where each of them worked in relative isolation and independently from one another, if you divided the total income of the company by the amount of individuals working in it, which in this example is 3, the probability that you would approach and even maybe exceed the $1 million threshold per individual is very likely to become much higher than if these individuals had kept on working on their own end, because naturally the complementarity of their individual skills and respective areas of expertise would imply that they could generate products that would leverage more than just the sum of their three contributions in isolation. Again, due to this cross-pollination effect, if you will. Even if the individuals were to accept to work as a group and to evenly split the company's income, as soon as the $1 million threshold would be reached, these guys would have to deal with an additional 15% reduction of their theoretical maximum income, which again implies that they would have to overcome a tax that is effectively about 2.44 times more impactful relatively to their potential maximum income compared to what they would have had to deal with if they were below the $1 million yearly income threshold. It's not as if these guys could work under, the same company name while they're collectively under the $1 million threshold, only to then disband the company, while each member manages to miraculously release modular components that would perfectly integrate with one another while maintaining complete, integration with zero compromise. So that scenario seems very unrealistic to me, even though I understand that, in effect, what happened over the last 12 years was that there was still a clear spirit of cooperation amongst developers, especially between the devs taking care of host applications and the devs taking care of creating sequencing tools and typical virtual instrument plugins. That takes me to the next big topic I wanted to cover, which is that established developers in the PC and Mac world treat iOS as an afterthought. What seems to be the meta for now is that while developer companies already established in the PC or Mac plugin world have already started to become involved with iOS, they seem to limit their involvement on the platform to the extent where they port their plugins to the iPad more or less as is, with user interfaces that are often made to be used with a mouse. Aside from the fact that this can really be a significant letdown in some cases, such as the obvious example of FabFilter plugins whose UIs haven't really been properly adapted to the context of the iPad touchscreen interface. In my experience, these ported products have often proved to come with significant challenges when it comes to optimization. Thankfully, though, this doesn't apply to all products. I will say that as far as FabFilter is concerned specifically, I am absolutely grateful for their presence on the platform, as their products are very stable and efficient, independently from the fact that I really wish more was done to make their plugins easier to manipulate with a touch screen. It's perfectly possible to work around this using a pen though, even though I rarely do, as I don't have an Apple Pencil, but I do have this little guy here. FabFilter remains by far one of the top developers on the platform, and I don't think that surprises anyone. On a side note, considering what I just explained, I really believe my channel has the potential to play a significant role in protecting the community from getting caught buying software that is not at a level of quality that is appropriate in the context of serious music production on the iPad, specifically when it comes down to considerations of stability and CPU resources usage efficiency in the context of the thermal limitations of the iPad Pro as a fanless device. Moving on, these implications have the consequence that users interested and invested in the iPad platform for music production end up having to navigate what I've come to describe as a jungle to find proven, reliable tools to support their music making on the iPad Pro at an advanced level. In spite of all this, brilliant independent developers like Jonathan Liliadal of Kymatica, Dmitry Pavlov from Jim Audio, Eric Sigth from Humble Tune, and Bram Bos from Ruismaker, just to name a few, still exist and have managed to consistently bless the world with some incredible software releases over these last 12 years. A byproduct of this meta, which is also interesting, is that over time, a distinct group of top-tier developers fueled by true passion rather than financial motivation has still managed to emerge, despite the fact that the Apple platform system was arguably not designed in their favor. Making it through this sort of filter means that these developers have reached a point where the community is much more likely to trust them and to want to reward and support them by buying most of their products simply out of loyalty because these developers have clearly demonstrated their merit. These developers have managed to get to that point despite the fact that to some extent they all have had to deal with the fact that working as a cohesive unit was absolutely not encouraged on iOS over these last 12 critical years, due to the financial implications of having to deal with Apple's App Store to be able to distribute their software products to the public. Consider that in parallel to all this, the budget that small independent developers could have afforded to allocate to involve testers in their development process in order to dramatically improve the quality, reliability, and ultimately the level of ambition of their projects on iPad instead went into the pockets of Apple. And the testers ended up being the community itself. Over these last 12 years or so, the community's time and hardware resources has been put to contribution extensively, and in many ways, this burdened the community to a significant extent, and this contributed to degrade the reputation and the appeal of the iPad platform to potential newcomers, as iOS can easily come across as some sort of a Wild West where we never know what's going to happen. How many times have users been lured into buying alluring, newly released software presented as a premium product, which might even, in some case, have already been well established in the PC and Mac world in previous years, only to discover that the product was unstable, half-baked, and therefore, in practice, essentially unusable. This takes me to the next big topic, which is that it's just a matter of time before iOS takes off on a large scale. In spite of all this stuff I've mentioned that's not so great, the beauty of software is that as years go by, inevitably issues get ironed out. And no matter how tortuous the path to product viability turns out to be, ultimately there comes a point where if the product comes from a developer that is truly invested in the platform and takes pride in his work, the product eventually gets refined to a point where a critical threshold of viability is reached. And once the tool is polished enough and simply continues to exist, the progression of time doesn't just delete these tools from existence. No. Instead, these reliable tools persist, and the list of them gets bigger and bigger. And in my view, this is clearly the stage we have started to reach at this point. With the perspective that I have, I see that there's a convergence happening between the major technological revolution that's taking place on the iPad platform with the emergence of the M4 iPad Pro and the observation that we seem to be reaching a point where a critical mass of reliable, optimized, and well-polished tools has been achieved so that all the mistakes of the past and all that history of things that were not pleasant to experience as a community is inevitably bound to make way for a new era where at some point a host application is bound to emerge, which will largely mitigate the shortcomings of the outdated MIDI technology while providing solid, flexible sequencing capabilities that will allow users to circumvent having to systematically involve MIDI, especially in situations where it's crippling musical creativity and possibilities. I'm hoping that this key host app is going to be AUM 2, but obviously I have absolutely no idea as to whether or not that's going to happen, as we are still subjected as a community to the financial implications inherent to this platform, and one-man operations can only accomplish so much without running into the very significant risk of a burnout. I'm hoping that the emergence of artificial intelligence is going to somehow provide ways to help small independent developers to start to get past at least some of these really tough hurdles, especially when it comes down to things like testing duties and optimization. I also believe that in the upcoming years, key companies that rely on relatively newer business models will start to emerge. These companies would aim at enabling other developers, including small developers, to achieve incredible things by providing these developers with reliable major building blocks as a foundation to build their music software apps with. Over time, I hope this will greatly contribute to shift the iOS developers community towards decoupling and, to an extent, circumventing the colossal challenge of engineering the core or the engine elements, if you will, of advanced host music software products in particular, in order to focus most of their efforts on the design of compelling concepts and new user interface element ideas, with an approach that puts a top priority on absolutely nailing ergonomics and inducing immersion in the context of touchscreen based hardware. I have the profound conviction that given the technology that we already have access to, all it takes is just for one key product to emerge and everything could change at an extremely fast pace. When and if that happens, it won't matter anymore that Apple grabs 30% of the developer's theoretical maximum income, because once the key tools actually exist at a level that becomes undeniable, we will have access to these tools and large-scale interest towards the platform will inevitably start to emerge. And from there, sky is the limit. Alright guys, that pretty much wraps up the video. Hopefully you enjoyed the talk and you've learned something useful that will have a positive impact in some way on how you approach making music on the iPad. If you've enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to my channel, as this will have a massive impact on the growth of my channel. And that'll, of course, also encourage me to continue making more videos. If you have any constructive comments or interesting ideas you'd like to share that are relevant in the context of the video, please don't hesitate to leave a comment below. There's no censorship on my channel for as long as the comments are remotely relevant and respectful. So feel free to write things that are more substantial if you'd like, without any risk of having your comment automatically censored silently. I've been on the receiving end of that automated moderation system, and I can definitely say that I don't want that system behavior to discourage people from expressing their opinions freely on my channel. Alright guys, that's it for now. Bye bye.